Hey everybody, Pastor Kevin here, bringing you this week's group curriculum guidance. We're in a pretty heavy chapter this week in Bizarre Bible. We're in the last one of this particular iteration of Bizarre Bible. It's in the book of Judges. And it's, man, I just want to make sure, read it carefully, read it wisely, because it is brutal. It is straight up brutal, and it's one of those stories that can get held against God, the Bible, Christians, whatever. But I think once you actually go through it, if you've heard the sermon, you'll see that there's a lot of reasons why something that is true and happened actually is in the Bible. It's for a purpose, right? So, with that said, let's jump into the questions. Please do know, like, I don't think any of you probably have kids in your group, but this is some pretty brutal content because it deals with sexual violence and it deals with violence in general, just a bunch of debauchery. So, that note to be taken. Question number 1, describe the horrific nature of this story. What do you think of the fact that the Bible contains stories like this? It's a simple question. I'll let you go through whatever you want. I mean, I think part of it is people could bring up other things that they've read in the Bible. They're like, how'd that get in there? That type of thing. The one thing I want you to do is always remember, as a leader, as a facilitator of your group, you should know and must trust the Bible knows what it's doing. And you will see by the end of this that it is true in this case as well. Question number 2, read Judges 19:1 and 10 through 15. Where did this story happen? Who are the parties involved? It's always important to ask this question. You want to know, like, where are we? What is this about? You may recall in one of our previous chapters, the idea was that they were in Bethel, right, which is known to not be a good place. If you look at this story, it's kind of the opposite. The places in the story are Bethlehem. You have Bethlehem in Judah. You'll have later on, this guy is sojourning from Ephraim, and they're going to Gibeah, and it's you will note there. Once you read through the whole thing, Jerusalem is mentioned, but you have to realize that at this point in the Bible, you got to know where you are in the story. At this point in the Bible, in Judges, Jerusalem was not necessarily the key place for Israel, right? It was still full of Jebusites. When Joshua took the charge of coming in and clearing the promised land for the people, that didn't fully get cleared. That's what part of the book of Judges is about. So there's still Jebusites in Jerusalem. So this Levite, it's very important that this is a Levite. This is one of the people who represents God, right? They are the clan, the tribe that doesn't get an allotment of land. They are actually, basically, God is their portion, their allotment, and they're called to be ministers around the tabernacle or the temple eventually. But here at this point in time, they don't go to Jerusalem because they're worried about foreigners, and they end up going to Gibeah, which is supposed to be a place that has their people. So one of the key points of all this is the story is happening in Israel's territory, in like places that are Israelite. It's home, in a sense, right? So we have a sojourner. That just means that they're traveling from one place to another. You have that they're from Ephraim, and you have them ending up in Gibeah is where the story ends up. Knowing those parties that are involved, knowing where it is, super important. Question number 3. Read Numbers 3, 5 through 13, and Deuteronomy 10, 9 through 8. What was the job of a Levite? Once you read these two texts, you see, like I said in the previous one, is that the Levites have this great calling. That Yahweh says that the Levites are mine. Right, that they're to minister before me. So they are carrying the ark, all of those things. So you see that the person who's core to this story, who kind of looks like a good guy, actually turns out not being such a good guy. And you get there eventually in the story. Question number 4. Judges 19 starts with the words, "In those days when there was no king in Israel." This phrase repeats at several locations in Judges. Who was supposed to be the king of Israel? Read 1 Samuel 8, 4 through 8, and Psalm 24. the book is making a very clear point that there was no king in Israel. Now, what you have to know is that at this point in the story, there isn't really a king, a true monarch in Israel, but God himself. God is the one who's supposed to be seen as king. He is the almighty, the all-powerful one who rules and is sovereign over the people of Israel, right? That's what Yahweh is. He's supposed to be sovereign. Granted, he's sovereign over more than that, but from the eyes of the Israelites and this Levite, he's the sovereign king. Right? But the author of the book wants to set apart this idea of saying, hey, there was no king. And in another section, it'll say there was no king and people did what was right in their own eyes. The whole point is this is an ominous, bad thing. There is no one being seen as the true leader, the one who gives the sovereign rule and reign of Yahweh. Nobody. There's no one around to do that. And that means that people do their own thing. Question number 5. Now read the story in Genesis 19, 1 through 11, and compare it to Judges 19. What is the author of Judges saying? This is the part where I think a lot of people might not have this info. You probably got it from the sermon, but maybe you didn't realize this before, but the Bible does this a lot. It hyperlinks to other parts of Scripture. There are core places where it'll say, hey, pay attention to what's going on here. Have you heard this before? Is it an echo of something previous? And in this case, it's an echo of Genesis 19. Once you read the story there, you're going to see, man, these stories are very similar, but the difference is it's talking about, in Genesis 19, it's talking about Lot in this foreign town of Sodom and Gomorrah, and this bad stuff happens in this foreign land, and God steps in and saves in the middle of that foreign land. Whereas at the end of Judges, after this downward cycle of bad, you'll see the cycle in Judges repeat, where it's literally the people are in good standing, they start to worship other gods or that type of thing. They get taken over. A consequence happens, usually just by one of the people that they didn't clear out of Israel. And then they cry out to God, and God appoints a judge to rescue them. And that cycle continues to go down, but it's going downward. It's getting worse and worse. And by the time we're at this place in Judges 19, you're seeing that, no, if you compare it to the Genesis 19 story, this is Israelite upon Israelite. There is no foreigner involved here. They are acting like foreigners. They're acting like the people that God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah because of the evil that they did. The same evil is happening among God's people centuries later. You see, the point is like we should feel this weight of, oh my gosh, this is horrible. It is absolutely everything that you came up with in question number 1. It's true. It's horrible. This is a horrible story. It is stuff that is not supposed to be seen as positive. Again, it is describing something, it's describing the way things were. And the way things were is it got to this point and then turns into civil war in Israel, where you have tribes fighting tribes. And one of the tribes is almost just eliminated. So I think it's important for us to keep reading, right? To know where the context of a given story is, but also know oftentimes the author is trying to give you this idea of something that has happened previously. Question number 6. When you become offended, do you believe the things that offend you also offend God? Give specific examples. How do we know if the things that offend us are offensive to God? This is an open-ended, essential question. It's basically just showing, like, hey, have you ever thought about, like, there are things that offend you that may not offend God? Like, sometimes we will take a cultural thing, and it becomes placed at a level of kind of a godlike thing. Think of it this way. A cultural rule becomes like a divine law in a way. So you become offended by that thing when in reality, maybe God maybe thinks the opposite way, right? Or those type of things. You see how oftentimes what offends us, you have to run it through as a Christian, you need to run it through the filter of, is this offensive to God? Right? That's just super good in a self-evaluative way, right? And I think of, am I doing something that would be offensive to the King of the universe, the one who created everything, the one who created me, and the one who, for all intents and purposes, has the ability to decreate whatever he wants, right? Am I on the same page as him in what is offensive? Do I ever try to calibrate like what's offensive to me and understand, is that offensive to God? Are there things that I am I take more offense to than maybe God would, or vice versa, right? Are there things that are super offensive to God that I'm kind of not noticing? I think it's important to look at that in a story like this, because the story is supposed to be offensive. It is. It's to show how dark and gruesome things have become in Israel after they were given the promised land. Like they've given a place by God that they were supposed to do stuff. They didn't. And they continue not only not to do those things, but they are getting sucked in by the nations around them and even defeated by the nations around them, where God has to come in and rescue them over and over again through the judges. Man, are there things within your life where you're like, yeah, maybe I'm not on the same page as God? Those are important to find and point out. So help your group to do that. Help them to ask more questions if they're getting into an area they're not sure. Help them. Question number 7. Identify some ways that we as Christians live life just like non-Christians in our world. How should we live differently? This is just continuing down the path of the other question, and it talks about, okay, now, from an observation from the outside looking in, how are we living our lives that actually may look like everyone else? Like, here's an example. It's like, have you read this story before in the book of Judges and just been so offended and maybe put your Bible down and just didn't continue? Or maybe you didn't give it the weight that it needed or try to understand what was going down in the story, and you just kind of passed over it, right? Okay, whatever, right? No, like, how is it that we are living as if we weren't Christians in this world? It's super important. This is something that I pray that you would help your group figure out about themselves. And the best way of starting is when you do that first and you're able to come to the table and say, yeah, I'm evaluating my life and how I'm living, and I'm noticing these things that look so much different than what I believe a Christian should be living like when I read my Bible. So it's important to get there. But a lot of this, I mean, the most important thing is there is a king, and he's on his throne. And when you get to the kind of the end of this, you see that there is an answer to the question. No, there is a king, and he's on his throne, and we know him as Jesus, right? So all the things that this Levite was not, all of the horror and difficulty of this story, actually, Jesus comes to undo. He's the one who wouldn't throw people out the door to be molested. He actually would step out the door and take on all the cosmic evil and molestation, so to speak, on our behalf. He's the guy who steps into the fray to protect and to save, right? That's our Redeemer. That's our King. There is a king on the throne, and that's why we should live differently. Right? So you can look at a story like this and get caught up, or you could really see the point is clear that Israel did have a king. It was Yahweh. It was God himself. And so do we. And we see it in the most clearest picture as a king who is enthroned on the cross, enthroned unto death for you and for me and for the people in your group. So I pray that you would just, that don't lose sight of that gospel message that sits in the middle of this horrific story, it's kind of like flipping it upside down and showing you, the things that you don't see here, we have seen in the goodness of our King. Okay? So I pray that the Spirit of the Lord goes with you. Pray you have a great group this week. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out.